and health. Now, why did I start with this one? Well, I started with this one because everybody needs conditioning. Now, whatever your role in the fitness industry may be, whether you're a coach, athletic trainer, therapist, athlete, some combination of the above, the reality is at some point in your career, you're going to be asked to train people who simply want to look and feel better, and conditioning plays a huge part in making sure they can achieve that goal. Now, if we look at the progression of disease in the United States from 1997 to 2011, there's a very clear and very troubling trend, and we can see this trend by looking at this graph. Obviously, you can see there's a steady increase in cardiovascular disease and related diseases such as strokes. Now, this comes despite the increased emphasis in recent years on eating healthier, eating more organic foods, eating more balanced meals, paying attention to calories and carbs, participation in gyms is at an all-time high, and yet we're still seeing this progressive increase in the number of people who die from preventable diseases like heart attacks and strokes. And the truth is that conditioning is our best weapon against this when we know how to develop it properly. So what does that look like? Well, what it comes down to is that conditioning is about preparing the body for the sympathetically driven stress of life. Now, we've talked a lot about the sympathetic system. We've talked about how it's tied to fight or flight, and not just physical stress, but also mental stress, and understanding how to develop the protection against the sympathetically driven stress of life is what developing conditioning for health is all about, because ultimately the people's ability to shut off that sympathetic system and activate that parasympathetic system is what's going to drive their health and wellness, and that's intimately tied to conditioning. Now, the other thing is that health and wellness is not just what happens in the gym. Okay, health and wellness is the result of the entire lifestyle, but, and here's where things become important as a coach or trainer, the training that you do in the gym can help develop and teach them valuable stress management and stress tolerance skills they can use to improve how they respond to stress outside the gym. So yes, conditioning can improve skills that then can be used to improve how people handle stress outside the gym, and thus improve their ability to have a healthy lifestyle, or at least deal with whatever lifestyle they have. The other thing to consider here is that conditioning and health and wellness, it's not just about sets and reps. It's about an education. It's about putting people through a process, and it's about giving them the tools and the fitness they need, again, in order to cope with the stress of daily life. So let's talk about what that looks like from the big picture. Okay, now obviously there's more to it than this, but the three main components of health and fitness as far as you're concerned as a coach or trainer is A, developing their aerobic fitness and their strength conditioning, their strength side as well, making sure their nutrition is where it needs to be and supports a healthy lifestyle and energy management. And then 3 is stress tolerance. Again, this comes down to teaching them the skills and giving them the fitness they need, but it also comes down to putting together an entire program that develops the body's ability to cope with stress. And again, we use training as a stress to help develop the body's ability to deal with all forms of stress, since all forms of stress are related to the sympathetic nervous system. Now, another thing to consider here is the role of inflammation in obesity and even lower levels of body fat. Now, this is a paper that was written in 2013 talking about the link between inflammation and obesity. And this is an area of study that's gotten a lot of attention in recent years, and what they're basically finding is that there's an intimate connection between obesity, the inflammatory process, and ultimately disease. Now, what this comes down to is what they call the deadly fat cycle. Okay, what they found and what scientists are discovering more and more about is that fat itself is inherently inflammatory. So when people live sedentary, high-fat diets, and when people are exposed to chronic levels of high mental stress, their fat cells inherently become more inflammatory. The inflammation itself leads to problems with insulin sensitivity and all sorts of other related metabolic conditions that facilitate increases in even more fat. And of course, again, the more fat you have, the more inflammation you can ultimately produce. And again, this is why it's called the deadly fat cycle. Fat produces inflammation, and inflammation leads to metabolic conditions that, again, predispose people to building more and more fat. And this is how people go down this cascade of negative events over time, where it leads to obesity and then down the path towards chronic disease, and ultimately, again, cardiovascular disease kills roughly 1 out of every 3 people in the US, and there's a simple reason for that, and it's largely related back to this inflammatory cycle that so many people get themselves stuck in. The other thing we talked about a bit earlier that needs to be reinforced is simply the role in inflammation that mental stress plays. And this is from a paper where they put people into a mentally stressed state. They essentially had them completing mentally challenging tasks in a research type setting that was mentally stressful to them. And then they measured the levels of inflammatory markers called cytokines throughout the bloodstream, both 45 minutes after the test was complete, as well as 2 hours after the test was complete. And again, what they're looking for here is a cytokine which represents inflammation called IL-6. And this is a very important inflammatory marker because it's been shown to predict heart attacks down the road. So people that inherently have higher levels of IL-6 in their bloodstream on a regular basis are at a greater risk for increased chance of getting heart attacks and strokes and all those sorts of related diseases. So what they found basically was in this study that up to 2 hours and even beyond, people were still showing this increase in interleukin-6 or IL-6 that, again, is a marker of inflammation. So it wasn't just that the task itself was stressful. It was that their stress levels and they're represented by this inflammation were increased 2 hours and beyond. And what they found was that the more stressful somebody found the test, the more inflammation they were finding in their bloodstream up to 2 hours and beyond. So again, inflammation isn't just something that happens from poor diet. It isn't just something that happens from chronic overtraining. It is something that happens from too much mental stress, because remember, as we talked about in the section on programming management, as we activate the sympathetic system, we inherently facilitate and promote the development of inflammation. And again, this paper is important simply because it shows people that mental stress leads to an increase in inflammation, not just during the stressor, but even in 2 hours past the task itself, people are still showing the effects of the stress. So mental stress itself is a big promoter of inflammation, and that's something we want to be able to protect against. Now, another thing we have to consider here is simply the role of stress in the brain itself. And they found another link here between how the brain deals with stress and the inflammation in brain cells themselves. And these glial cells are essentially the supportive cells within the brain. They're what help the brain function and help the nervous system essentially do its job throughout the entire brain. And they basically have found this connection between chronic stress and the activation of these brain cells and their inflammatory release of these same sort of markers. So again, we're seeing this pattern over and over again, and more research is simply showing us that chronic stress leads to chronic inflammation, and this chronic inflammation then leads to a whole host of problems. In the brain in particular, we can see some studies here where they looked at people's prefrontal cortex and hippocampus, which is an area associated with memory and learning, and we can look at the difference in development in this area of the brain from normal people versus people under chronic stress. So we can see the normal control group in the top image, and we can see people under chronic stress in the bottom image. Now, what this shows us very clearly is that chronic stress impairs our ability to learn, and impairs our ability to have good memory, and impairs our ability to think critically. Now, in the other image here, we can see again a control group, and we can see a group under chronic stress. Except in this area, they were looking at what's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is something that processes fear and processes risk. And basically, you see the opposite here. You see that the amygdala and the connections in that area of the brain actually grow. And as somebody's exposed to chronic stress, they ultimately become more fearful. They become less likely to venture out of their house. And this is something we see in old people all the time. They're afraid of falling over. They don't want to leave. And basically what you see is that people exposed to chronic stress over time, they essentially become more afraid of doing things. They become more risk adverse, which makes sense because if someone's been chronically under stress, the brain tries to protect against that. What's the best way to do that is simply to avoid any sort of risky situation where, again, you may be exposed to further stress. So what we see is that there's a progression. Okay, stress ultimately kills 1 out of every 3 people, and it could be higher than that depending on how you lump some of the diseases together. And what we see essentially is that chronic hypertension, okay, in other words, having your blood pressure raised, which is the result of increasing the sympathetic nervous system, which again increases blood flow, increases blood pressure, and ultimately is a hypertension driving event. We see that when that happens too frequently, too often, the walls of the arteries thicken to protect against high blood pressure. We get inflammation that results again from that sympathetic nervous system activating chronically. The cholesterol and the platelets and different things that flow through those blood vessels start to collect and build against artery walls, and ultimately you get a artery that simply can't have good blood flow, and blood flow is restricted. And as blood flow gets restricted, that only serves to increase blood pressure even more. And again, you get this deadly cycle over a period of time where blood pressure keeps going up as these arteries start to close. And if you look on the right hand side there, that is fundamentally what it looks like. Now, a normal healthy artery should not have any of that junk littered throughout the middle of it. It should have good blood flow throughout, but you can see very clearly that this is not going to be a healthy artery where blood's going to fill the way that it needs to. So again, chronic stress over time leads to physiological changes within the body, and frequently those changes are mitigated by chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation causes all sorts of negative things to happen that affect our metabolism, that affect our brain, that affect our cardiovascular system as a whole, and ultimately lead us down a path towards death and disease rather than towards a path of health and wellness. So this is what we have to combat. This is what conditioning is for, and this is why I started this one, because everybody has a loved one, a friend, a family member who has died from a cardiovascular related disease that ultimately could have prevented. Research shows up to 60, 70%, or even sometimes more of these sorts of diseases could be prevented with changes in lifestyle and ultimately changes in conditioning, because that's, again, our best defense against these sorts of diseases. So excessive stress leads to chronic inflammation. This leads to obesity and excessive body fat. It leads to cardiovascular disease. It leads to gradual memory loss over time. It leads to anxiety and a fear of basically being active. And ultimately, it leads to a range of diseases. So the most important thing we can do to help people prevent all these negative things, to help the loved ones and the friends and family members live a long, happy, healthy life without these sorts of things, is to help them develop their fitness. And we do that by helping them develop their conditioning, not just in terms of the energy production side, but also in terms of the stress tolerance side, by teaching them how to effectively deal with stress. Again, training is a stress, and we can use it as a stress that helps build them up rather than break them down. So coming up in the next video, I'm going to talk about how do we do that, how do we help people ultimately become more stress resistant, rather than just piling more training on top of them that can actually make the situation worse, and how do we use conditioning ultimately as a tool to combat the chronic diseases that kill so many people. All right, so next up, we'll talk more specifically about that area of things and how we use conditioning to help people live better, longer, healthier